Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shreya, and today I will be presenting the findings of my research, which assessed the biodegradation of bio-based horticultural containers in relation to reforestation effectiveness and forest carbon management. Supervised by Dr. Sally Krigstin and Ryan Munroe from NVK Nurseries, the goal of this research was to link sustainable nursery practices with long-term forest carbon management in Canada. So to set the stage, I'll provide a little bit of context about the horticultural industry. The current industry standard is heavily dependent on the use of plastic due to traditional systems that integrated it for improved efficiency. And while container-grown trees are excellent for outplanting purposes because they reduce the risk of transplant shock and also offer more flexibility for planting timelines in comparison to bare root trees, the plastic material of the container itself presents several problems. So first, a concern is that plastic containers create a significant stream of waste as well as negative carbon emissions. Even if used several times, the material will not degrade in the soil, and if not properly disposed of or recycled, it will accumulate space in landfills, which risk contaminating our soils and our groundwater. Secondly, the process of removing the pot may result in extra manual labor, creating less efficient tree planting systems. As well as that, the physical removal of the container may also cause root disturbance, loss, or even damage, resulting in difficulties in the successful establishment of the tree. And finally, the non-permeable walls of plastic containers may also cause root girdling, which is the act of the root choking the base of its trunk, ultimately constricting the vascular flow of the tree. This would also be severe as it will make the tree more susceptible to slower establishments after it has been outplanted. Ultimately, these associated issues have led to increased interest in alternative materials to plastic. However, there is limited research on how they may perform in Canadian forest soils. So here we just have some examples of what root growth looks like in various horticultural containers. On the far left, you can see what the taproot of a red oak looks like within a plastic container, and you can see that it is circling within itself. Whereas in the middle and on the far right, you can see how alternatives to plastic, such as coconut coir and the regular planted biopots, have permeable sidewalls that allow for air root pruning. This encourages lateral growth of the roots, preventing the circling that we traditionally see within plastic containers. So unfortunately, there have been recent program and budget cuts within tree planting initiatives. But because of that, it is essential that nurseries have more efficient strategies and also improve their stock quality. Nursery container choice is often overlooked, but critical in achieving sustainable outcomes. The widespread use of plastic containers undermines environmental goals due to their associated carbon emissions with their use, as well as pollution. This is potentially where biodegradable containers can play a huge impact. By eliminating the need to remove the physical container, they can reduce outplanting labor as well as streamline waste management for further purposes. However, before this widespread adoption, it is essential that we look and quantify material degradation as well as their carbon implications. So this led me to the following four objectives to further my research on this topic. First, to quantify the degradation rates of various bio-based materials in Canadian forest soil. Second, to evaluate material suitability within the Canadian context. Third, to explore the implications for carbon management and also environmental benefits. And finally, to be able to provide recommendations to Canadian nurseries that grow native trees. So for this experiment, I tested 7 different bio-based containers that are all available on the market. These included Cowpot, Jiffy, Coconut Coir, Regular Planty Biopot, Enhanced Planty Biopot, Fertile, and EcoGrow. On the slide behind me, you can see the material composition of these various horticultural containers, and this also highlights the range of materials that we can look to when trying to deviate from the use of plastic within the industry. For the experiment, I followed the American Society for Testing and Materials G16012 standard, which is the standard practice for evaluating microbial susceptibility of non-metallic materials by laboratory soil burial. This standard ensured that my results were comparable, but also reflective of processes that we expect within natural soil environments. It provided guidelines that standardized my experimental setup, such as soil preparation, sample preparation, the maintenance of the experiment, as well as how to read my data and retrieve my data at the end. Furthermore, since majority of the dry mass of lignocellulosic and organic material is carbon, I used the formula for percent mass loss as a proxy for carbon loss throughout the degradation experiment, which you can see on the slide over there. So here are just some visual examples of the ASTM standardized setup. So you can see that I cut the biopot samples into 5 by 5 centimeter squares, and I also soaked them in water prior to the burial until they reach their maximum absorption. The standardized guidelines, in short, required a 50-50 ratio of porous soil as well as soilless mix. So that was the preparation for soil. And then you can see that I buried the samples at a depth of 6.7 centimeters, as well as within a total depth of 12.7 centimeters. Throughout the experiment, I maintained a moisture level within the soil between 20 to 30% because this ensured aerobic conditions throughout the experiment. And finally, I removed the samples on dedicated extraction days, brushed it off, and oven dried them at 105 degrees Celsius until constant dry mass was achieved. And in this case, it took 30 hours. So here we can see the results of the experiment. So this graph highlights the percentage of dry mass loss for each material at 5 different extraction periods. Evidently, the regular biopot sample degraded the fastest and most completely by day 97 of my experiment. Followed closely by EcoGrow and the enhanced biopot samples, a commonality between these three biopot containers were their paper-based material composition. The peat and coconut coir samples also had the slowest degradation and the least percentage dry mass loss by the end of the experimental period. Fertile and cowpot samples showed mid-range results, but also had high variability. But overall, we can say that the greatest amount of degradation occurred between days 15 and 48 of the experiment. So as seen in the previous graph, the error bars indicated high variability between the sample results. So consequently, I tested them for significance using Dunn's post hoc test to determine which pairwise comparisons really differed from one another. So each cell on this chart shows the differences in average percent dry mass loss between each treatment. And as you can see, the results highlight that the enhanced biopot, the regular biopot, and EcoGrow samples degrade statistically more than Jiffy and coir materials. This reinforces the notion that degradation of different materials can be influenced by various factors, and therefore we need to further analyze what these commonalities may be. So following the comparisons that indicated statistically significant differences in percentage mass loss, like I said, there is a commonality between those that degraded the fastest. And that was the paper-based compositions, which you can see on the slide. So enhanced biopot, regular biopot, and EcoGrow showed the most substantial mass loss, ranging between 70 to 82% by the end of the experimental period. This rapid breakdown is likely due to their material composition. And since these three bio-based containers are primarily paper-based, they're rich in fiber but also have low lignin amounts. And this composition is ideal for microbial breakdown, particularly under aerobic conditions, which is what we find in Canadian soils. Interestingly, if paper were to break down in anaerobic settings, it would release methane as well as carbon dioxide, which would be detrimental to the carbon cycle. This highlights the importance of choosing proper burial sites for paper residual breakdown, such as aerobic soils, to reduce excess greenhouse gas emissions. On the other hand, the slowest materials to degrade were the coconut coir samples and the peat-based Jiffy samples. Both these materials showed an overall mass loss of under 40% by the end of the experimental period. This is likely due to both of them having much denser fiber strands and structures within their compositions. So unlike the paper-based materials, coconut coir and peat-based compositions have high levels of lignin. Considering coconut coir ranges from 40 to 50% lignin content based on its dry weight, its molecular structure is much more complex, making it more difficult for microbes and enzymes to break down the material. Similarly can be said about the peat-based Jiffy pots, and that would explain the lack or slower degradation that you see on the screen. So while these materials, we do anticipate that they will eventually break down, the concern with these slower degrading materials is that it implies that the container will stay largely intact for longer periods of time after it has been buried in the soil. This is important to understand as it may influence root growth, preventing further root growth through restrictive container walls, unable to break down adequately. So that's the concern that we see with plastic containers, preventing the roots from growing laterally. So beyond degradation, the core of this research does touch upon carbon management. If we follow the IPCC's guidelines, degradation of biomass is generally considered carbon neutral. However, it is important to understand pathways and what that can mean for emissions. Under aerobic conditions, biomass breaks down into predominantly carbon dioxide, and this is relevant as they are typically found within Canadian forest soils. On the other hand, anaerobic conditions material breaks down into both carbon dioxide and methane. Methane is an extremely potent greenhouse gas and may worsen environmental conditions if it is continuously released. Furthermore, the use of peat-based products such as Jiffy has an environmental cost. Peatlands act as a long-term carbon sink, and when we degrade or disturb it for peat extraction, they lose their carbon sequestration potential, turning into a carbon source, so becoming a large net greenhouse gas source. This is crucial as raw material sourcing highlights how paper-based alternatives support circular economy frameworks through the recycling of materials. Not only can biomass residuals be recycled and refurbished into horticultural containers, but we can also encourage paper-based degradation in aerobic forest soils rather than anaerobic landfill conditions where more potent greenhouse gases would be released. Overall, this research ultimately aims to be digestible and support change and provide practical advice for Canadian nurseries to adopt fast-degrading horticultural containers that can offer a range of benefits. Firstly, they have the potential to provide a better quality of seedling by eliminating the risk of root circling that we traditionally see in plastic containers. They can also significantly reduce potential labor in outplanting as no pots will need to be removed during that stage. The lack of removal will likely also protect the root system, causing less disturbance in the establishment of the tree. Furthermore, this would provide more flexibility with planting timelines when we're comparing it to bare root tree stock. And finally, this process would result in less waste and plastic consumption within the horticultural industry. So to conclude, the biggest takeaway is that biodegradable containers are not all alike. Differences in degradation and material extraction can play a huge role in how these containers can shape our future. Without a doubt, the paper-based containers degrade the fastest and most completely and offer minimal long-term impacts on the soil, especially within the Canadian forest soil context. The slowest and most disruptive materials were peat-based Jiffy pots. With their high lignin content, microbes were unable to break down the material rapidly, but also their associated carbon emissions for raw material extraction place many concerns about future climate conditions. While alternative materials reduce the emissions associated with plastic use, the best choice will always support one that supports low carbon systems and also implements climate-smart strategies. Ultimately, incorporating circular bio-based alternatives, which refurbish biomass residuals and reduce waste streams, can make large-scale planting programs more efficient and more effective in the long term. While more research will be necessary, exploring these alternatives provides actionable data for Canadian nurseries to make informed decisions about future planting efficiencies and also our national carbon management goals. And with that, I wanted to give a big thank you to those who supported me throughout this process. Thank you to Sally and the Krigstin lab who helped me navigate this research since day one, to Ryan Munroe who provided insights and the necessary perspective on the nursery industry, as well as my MFC cohort who continuously inspired me throughout this program, and to my friends and family watching. Thank you.
Ryan Munroe from NBK Nurseries is joining us online. And
he's here. Hold on, give him a moment.
I'm here.
Go ahead, Ryan. The floor is yours.
Great presentation, Shreya. Hopefully you guys can hear me. Yeah, I have one main question I wanted to ask you. If you had the opportunity, not necessarily to do the research, but to recommend continuing research on specifically the biopot, what direction would you take that in? Like understanding that also some of your other the other students in the MFC have also done some research on it. What would you specifically like to continue the research on with the biopots?
I think particularly with the biopots, because my research is quite preliminary, and at this stage, I don't have too much data on how they perform beyond this degradation. Because I only cut samples, I would like to see more research on how they perform after being outplanted, so how the material holds up and breaks down after it has been put into the soil. Also with various species and how that could influence the needs of the tree, as well as how compatible it would be with the containers, just because I think a range of species could influence different containers may benefit different species differently. So testing it out with various species could be beneficial. And also the long-term impact. So my experiment the experiment is still ongoing, but I only have the data until 97 days. So seeing long-term impacts of larger containers that are 1 gallon, 2 gallon, and seeing how that breaks down would be good.
Great. I think NVK can help with all that in the future.
Amazing.
So you let Sally know.
Yeah.
Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. I'm turning the floor over to Sally.
Great presentation, Joel. Can you explain why the material in the top is sit on the greenhouse shelf for however long you guys grew them over the summer?
Mhm.
And then you planted them in your soil and you degraded? Can you explain that?
So it's the same way that like when a tree is growing, it doesn't just decompose or break down. It's more of the material only starts to degrade once it's in the soil, primarily because of the microbes in the soil. So how that interacts with the material and works to break down. So first you'll see in the paper-based components, the cellulose will break down a lot quicker, and that's why we see that kind of plateau in the results, because there at that point it's predominantly the leftover lignin left behind. And so the material in a greenhouse condition, because they're not really affected by excess moisture and also excess microbes trying to break apart the material, it's able to withstand greenhouse conditions and only breaks down in the soil after. If that's
Thanks for that. I have one more question. So you pointed out that IPCC used biomass degradation as carbon neutral. You, seeing the context and the difference of your talks and the result of those, do you agree with their position on that?
I think it's really hard to declare that something is completely carbon neutral, because even if eventually the lack of emissions or it returning to the environment will kind of counter the negative impacts, that emission still is released at some point, whether it's in the manufacturing or the transporting of the materials. So it's really hard to say, like, in the grand scheme of things, anything can be carbon neutral, particularly with the degradation aspect of it. I think it helped to support the narrative that certain materials can be seen as less detrimental than others, especially when you compare paper-based to peat-based products, because the extraction of the raw material of peat would cause so much more disturbance in the environment than using industrial residuals to just incorporate existing materials that we have and refurbish them. So I understand where they're coming from to say that it's carbon neutral, but I don't completely agree with that notion.
Thank you.
Really thoughtful. Who else has a question for Shreya? Sean.
Right, so those microbes, they, is there, the ASTM method, is there a standard soil that's used? So you would think that the degradation could vary quite a lot, depending on the type of soil. So I might be more concerned to have comparable results that there should be strict control over that.
Right. So the standard does say that by using it would help you to create standardized methods so that it's repeatable. But in addition to that, there are some aspects of it that highlight that it's also to your convenience and how it works to your experimental setup. So in our case, these pots would be buried at a certain depth. So the soil that we got from the forest was predominantly a horizon, if we could, or soil that would go until the depth that the pots would be buried at, in order to see how that material would perform in that kind of condition. And since it did require a 50-50 ratio of soilless mix and whatever forest soil we use, that was just standardized. And I guess further field trials would be necessary to see how it react in fully forest conditions and not just laboratory settings.
And one more just comment, on the root girdling, most pots used at large scale in tree operations have ridges along
Yes.
that.
Yes.
I was curious, are there these biodegradable pots, are those incorporating ridges to prevent root girdling as well or not?
I think it depends on the company, or for lack of a better word, like whoever manufactures the horticultural container. There are different sizes and shapes. So some of them are more square shaped, some of them are circular. So it depends how that works in terms of how they design their pots. That being said, I have seen some containers, for example, the biopot. There's like a dip in the container which kind of supports it or helps create like a thinner area within the container that allows for more permeable root to grow through. So it depends on the material and the design of the container, but they're there.
Great presentation. Learning a lot from that. I understand that your objective is quantifying degradation, but in terms of thinking about next steps, how do you think that these pots, what's the like ethical imperative on their impact on the quality of the soil?
So if I understand right, you mean how could these pots potentially impact the soil once they're in the ground? So based just on my research, I would advise against the use of coconut coir pots just because those containers are imported in from external places. So that's not really native to Canadian forest soils. And I'm not too certain about how that kind of looks and degrades long term in our soils here. In terms of the other materials, I have done some literature review that highlight that the materials mixed in with organic fertilizer can initially enhance how it helps the tree grow or improves microbial activity initially in the soil. But once it's outplanted, I'm not too sure about the long-term impacts because the assumption is that extra nutrients would have already done its work before it's planted in the like growing stages. If that answers your question. Yeah.
Are there any other final words from the assembled for Shreya? Shreya, thank you